It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I had been planning this camping trip for months. The rain wasn't supposed to be so heavy, though. It came down in sheets, hammering against the roof of the small camper I had parked by the edge of the forest. The kind of rain that made it impossible to hear anything beyond the steady drum of water hitting the metal. I was out in the middle of nowhere, far enough away from civilization that the constant noise of the rain felt different. It felt like I was alone in a world that didn't care if I was there or not. The campsite wasn't fancy, just a patch of dirt next to a narrow creek that ran through the woods. It was remote, peaceful, perfect for clearing my head. Or it was supposed to be. I had arrived earlier that afternoon, eager to spend the weekend hiking the trails around the area. No plans, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the rain. When I set up the camper, I had only seen a few other vehicles parked at the entrance. It didn't look like anyone else had planned to stay overnight. That should have been a sign, but I ignored it. As night began to fall, the rain intensified. The sound of it crashing against the camper roof was overwhelming. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a freight train. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the storm, some branch or something caught in the wind, but the sound didn't stop. It was a thud, faint but persistent. Not quite a tree falling, not quite something natural. Came from the woods, somewhere far off in the distance. I couldn't place it, but I knew it wasn't right. My instincts told me to ignore it, but something in my gut made me step out of the camper anyway. I grabbed a flashlight, hesitated, and then pushed the door open. The rain hit me instantly, cold and hard, but I didn't care. I needed to know what it was. I stood there for a moment, scanning the dark forest in front of me. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking under the pressure. The creek nearby rushed faster than I'd ever heard it, the water turning brown with the rain. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer. It wasn't just a thud anymore. It sounded like someone was moving through the brush, and it wasn't normal. Not the kind of movement an animal would make. It was heavier, dragging something, and whatever it was coming toward me. A chill ran down my spine. My first thought was to lock the camper door, stay inside, and pretend I didn't hear it. But the curiosity, no, the terror, kept me frozen. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the storm. It was something else. I shined the flashlight into the woods. The beam flickered as the wind knocked it around. I felt my heart pound in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to get back inside and forget about it. But I stepped forward, the cold rain seeping into my clothes. Then I saw it, a figure, barely visible but unmistakable. It was hunched over, dragging something heavy across the muddy ground. I couldn't make out the details in the dim light, but the movement was wrong. The figure didn't seem human. It was too stiff, too deliberate. My hand froze on the flashlight as I took another step forward. I could hear the rain beating down harder now, the wind almost deafening. But I couldn't look away. It was dragging something, a body. I froze, my mind spinning. Couldn't be. It just couldn't. But the figure was dragging something large, something lifeless. It wasn't a trick of the light. There was no mistaking it. I stepped back, my heart racing. I had to get back to the camper. I had to lock the door, call someone, anyone. But as I turned, a loud crack sounded behind me, followed by the distinct, wet sound of boots sinking into the mud. The figure was closer. I stumbled back toward the camper, but my foot caught on something, slipping in the slick mud. I went down hard, the flashlight tumbling from my hand, landing with a dull thud against the ground. I scrambled to my feet, panicked. My mind was reeling. I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't leaving. I reached for the door to the camper, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handle. It was locked, but my mind wasn't clear. I fumbled with the key, heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I heard a rustling in the trees, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving closer. I finally yanked open the door, stumbling inside, slamming it behind me. The sound of the rain and wind was deafening, but there was something else now. Something heavy. The air felt thick, oppressive. I didn't move from the doorway, staring out the small window. My breath came in ragged gasps as I waited, every muscle in my body screaming to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave now. I was stuck. And then I saw it. The figure dragging the body was standing at the edge of the campsite. I couldn't see its face, but it was there, watching. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its presence like a shadow in the rain. I didn't know how long I stayed there, staring at the figure. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. But eventually it began to move again. Slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked into the woods, dragging the lifeless body behind it. Couldn't breathe. When I finally found the strength to move, I locked all the doors, closed the blinds, and turned off the lights. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call. I was miles from anyone, stuck in the middle of a storm, with no signal and no way out. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the forest was still eerily quiet. I tried to leave to get back to civilization, but as I drove past the spot where I had seen the figure, something caught my eye. The ground was disturbed. Mud had been dragged across the path, and the body, what was left of it, was gone. I didn't stick around long enough to investigate. I sped out of there, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The police came out after I reported what I had seen. They checked the area, but they didn't find anything. No body, no trace of whoever or whatever I had seen in the woods. They told me I was imagining things, that it was the storm playing tricks on me, but I knew better. The truth is, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what was dragging that body through the woods, but I'm not going back to those woods. I'll never go back. Something was out there, and it's still out there, waiting. I don't care what anyone says. It was real, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching. It had been a long day, and I was ready to get some rest. The sun had already set, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple as I drove down the isolated stretch of highway. I was about an hour away from my camping spot, deep in the forests of northern Montana. I'd been driving through these winding roads for what felt like forever, and there was nothing but trees, rolling hills, and the occasional sign for the few small towns scattered miles apart. The roads were barely wide enough for 2 cars, and the trees seemed to press in on me, as though they were closing in. I had planned this trip for a while, just me, my tent, and the open road. I'd been feeling burnt out from work, and a few days in nature sounded like the perfect way to unwind. I'd read a lot about camping in these remote areas, how peaceful it was, how you could feel completely disconnected from the world. I was looking forward to a night under the stars. As I drove, I couldn't help but notice the odd stillness around me. It was the middle of autumn, so I expected to hear the rustling of leaves, but there was nothing. The trees were quiet, and the air felt unnaturally calm. I had driven through plenty of remote places before, but something about this particular stretch of road felt off. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the solitude that made me feel uneasy. Eventually, I turned off the main highway and onto a dirt road that led to the campsite I had booked. The road was narrow, surrounded by thick trees on both sides. The headlights of my truck illuminated the path ahead, casting long shadows that made the forest seem even denser. There was no sign of anyone else, no other vehicles, no signs of life. It felt like I was the only person in the world. I drove slowly, scanning the area for the turnoff that would take me to my campsite. The silence was broken only by the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel, the engine hum, and the occasional rustling of branches in the wind. As I rounded a bend, I finally saw it. A small clearing on the left side of the road. The campsite. I parked my truck, grabbing my gear and stepping out into the cold night air. It was quiet here, too quiet. The forest seemed even darker than before, as though the trees were pressing in around me. I shrugged again, not sure if it was the fading daylight or just my imagination running wild. The area was beautiful, the perfect place to unwind. I set up my tent in the clearing, the only sounds being the occasional snap of a twig under my boots and the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. It wasn't the most glamorous spot, but it would do. Once my tent was set up, I started a small fire in the fire pit. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and I sat back on my camping chair, staring into the flickering light. As the fire crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around, but the forest remained as still as it had been when I first arrived. My truck was parked a little ways back, the headlights dimming in the distance, but I noticed something strange. There were no other vehicles around. I hadn't passed anyone on the road in what seemed like hours, and the only noise now was the occasional rustling of branches, still more unsettling than peaceful. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I had camped alone before, but the unease lingered. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from knowing something is there. It was more of a primal instinct that something was wrong, something out of place. I pulled a jacket around me, the temperature beginning to drop, and continued staring into the fire. My mind wandered to the events of the past few days. Work, stress, everything piling up. I had come here to clear my head, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let up. Then I heard it, a rustling sound in the trees, too deliberate to be an animal. It was a faint crunch, followed by a pause. I sat up, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone or something was moving through the woods. My heart began to race, but I convinced myself it was just a deer or another camper. There were hiking trails nearby, and it wasn't unheard of for people to walk through the area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rustling continued, and this time, it didn't sound like an animal at all. The steps were heavier, closer. I stood up, moving quietly to my truck to grab a flashlight. My instincts told me to be cautious. If it was another camper, they should have announced themselves by now, but there was nothing. No voices, no sounds of a campfire, no indication that anyone else was around. Just the soft, creeping sounds of movement in the trees. I switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness in front of me. The area around my tent was still, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I couldn't see much, only the silhouette of a person. Tall, unnaturally still. My heart hammered in my chest, my hand tightening around the flashlight. I don't know why I didn't call out. Maybe I was hoping it was just someone who had wandered off the trail, but something about the figure didn't sit right. The way it stood, motionless, was unsettling. I stared at the figure for what felt like an eternity, but it didn't move. There was no sound, no sign of life. It was as if it was waiting for something or someone. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on it. Every part of me screamed to get into the truck, to drive away, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my brain telling me to stay calm, to assess the situation. But there was no way to explain what I was seeing. Who would be out here standing like that without saying a word? The wind picked up, the trees groaning as the air swept through them, but the figure remained motionless. Something was terribly wrong. I slowly turned around and grabbed my keys from my pocket, ready to make a run for it. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, quick and heavy. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I ran for my truck, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear the figure moving behind me, the sound of its footsteps gaining on me as I fumbled with my keys. The flashlight slipped from my hand, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I shoved the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look out the window. I didn't want to see anything. I slammed the truck into reverse and sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up gravel. The truck bounced over the uneven ground, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of there. As I drove back down the narrow road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The clearing was just a dark spot in the distance now, and there was no sign of anyone following me. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, and even then, I didn't feel safe. I drove for hours, not stopping once, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I never went back to that campsite. When I finally made it to the nearest town, I stayed at a motel and tried to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how I told the story to myself, it didn't feel real. There were no other campers around, no signs of anyone else. It had just been me and that figure. The fear that gripped me that night never fully left. It lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that sometimes the woods hold more than just nature. Sometimes they hold things that can't be explained, things that shouldn't be there. And as I sat in the motel room, my eyes lingering on the road outside, I realized I wasn't just afraid of what I had seen. I was afraid of what I hadn't seen. It was the summer of 2019, and I decided to go camping with my grandfather and his ex-wife, Janet. It wasn't my ideal situation. I hadn't seen Janet in years, but she insisted on coming, and my grandfather, who was getting older, wanted to keep the peace, so we went ahead with the trip. We planned to camp out in the Adirondacks, a place my grandfather used to visit with his friends when he was younger. I wasn't sure how I felt about the trip, but I figured it would be good for him to get out of the house. The campgrounds were secluded, deep in the woods, miles away from any signs of civilization. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just the sounds of nature. The area felt ancient, untouched by modern hands, the trees towering high above us as we made our way to the campsite. My grandfather was in his late 70s now, still tough as nails, but you could see the age in him, slower movements, a few more aches than before. Janet, on the other hand, had barely aged a day since the last time I saw her. She was in her early 60s, but carried herself with a youthful energy that seemed almost out of place for someone her age. We set up camp in a small clearing, the soft rustling of leaves and distant bird calls all we could hear. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about the quiet. The kind of silence that felt too heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. We got a fire going and started to cook dinner, the flames flickering, casting long shadows across the trees. It was peaceful at first, just the three of us around the fire, but that peace didn't last long. As the night grew darker, I started to feel a strange unease. The woods around us were thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, creeping in closer to our campsite. Janet, as usual, was chatting away about some random thing. She was always the talkative one, but even her voice didn't seem to carry the same warmth it once did. There was an edge to it, something off that I couldn't place. I tried to shake the feeling off. Then it happened. The sound. First, it was so faint I thought it was just the wind. A rustling noise, like something moving through the underbrush just beyond the firelight. I glanced at my grandfather, but he didn't seem to notice. Janet, however, had gone completely still. Her face was expressionless, staring into the fire like she was lost in thought. But then the noise came again, closer this time. I tensed up. It wasn't an animal. It was something heavier, something deliberate. My heart began to race. I looked around, but the shadows of the trees were thick, and the fire only illuminated a small circle around us. That's when I heard it, a soft thud, like footsteps in the dirt. I was about to ask my grandfather if he heard it too when I noticed something in the distance, just outside the reach of the firelight. It was a shape tall and thin, standing motionless between two trees. I could barely make it out, but it was there watching us. My chest tightened as I stared at it, and I had a feeling, something primal, that it wasn't just some trick of the light. My grandfather finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. Before I could respond, there was a rustle from the other side of the camp. My heart nearly stopped. I looked over, expecting to see a bear or some other wild animal, but instead, there was nothing, just the same deep shadows. Janet stood up suddenly, brushing the dirt off her pants. She wasn't looking at either of us, her gaze fixed on the edge of the woods. Her body was stiff, her face pale. I watched her for a second, confused, but then I followed her gaze. There, beyond the firelight, I saw something, or rather someone. A figure, humanoid in shape, but moving differently, almost unnaturally. It had no clear features, no identifiable characteristics. It was as if it blended into the shadows themselves. I stood up, my breath catching in my throat. "Grandpa?" I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. My grandfather squinted into the darkness but said nothing. He wasn't as quick as he used to be, but even so, I could see the recognition in his eyes. He knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, there was another thud, louder this time, much closer than before. I turned to face the noise, my pulse hammering in my ears. My body went cold as I realized that the figure wasn't alone. There were others moving through the woods, circling us. I didn't know how many, but I could feel the eyes on me, could sense them all around. Panic rose in my chest, and I felt myself moving backward, away from the fire. It wasn't until my foot hit something hard that I snapped out of it, realizing that I was backing into the shadows. I quickly turned around and grabbed the first thing I could, an axe my grandfather had left by the campfire. "What is it?" Janet finally asked, her voice trembling for the first time that night. My grandfather stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the dark woods. "Stay close," he said gruffly, taking his own axe from the ground. I didn't want to stay close. I didn't want to be anywhere near this place anymore. But what could we do? We were out here far from any help. There was no way to escape. For what felt like hours, we stood there, listening to the sounds of the woods around us. The figures, whatever they were, never made a sound, but we could feel them watching, moving just out of sight. I could sense the weight of their presence, their eyes boring into us. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The woods fell silent. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like an eternity. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, casting the smallest amount of light. My grandfather finally broke the silence, his voice low. "Get the gear. We're leaving." I didn't argue. I grabbed what I could, throwing it all into the bags without thinking. The air felt thick, suffocating. We moved quickly, silently, in the dim light of the embers. Janet didn't speak, didn't even look at me. Her eyes were fixed ahead, locked on something I couldn't see. We didn't look back as we left the campsite, stepping over the roots and branches in a mad rush. It felt like the woods themselves were closing in, pushing us forward. We moved faster, each of us lost in our own thoughts, afraid of what might happen if we stopped. By the time we reached the car, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. The woods had fallen silent, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The hairs on the back of my neck still stood up. I could still feel their eyes on me, even as we drove away. The forest, the darkness, it was like a living thing watching, waiting for us to leave. The whole way home, no one spoke. My grandfather kept his eyes on the road, his face set in a grim expression. Janet had her arms crossed, staring out the window. I didn't know if she was scared or if she had just shut down completely. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt a strange sense of relief, like we had escaped something. Something that had been stalking us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I looked out the window, glancing at the woods one last time, but there was nothing there. It took me a long time to get the image of that figure out of my head. I still wonder what it was, who or what had been watching us that night. It wasn't something I ever wanted to see again. But I know one thing for sure: we weren't supposed to be there. The forest had its secrets, and we had unknowingly stumbled into one of them. I never went camping again after that night. It was a warm September afternoon when my manager, Greg, decided we all needed a break from the grind of our office work. The bank had been going through some intense periods, and he thought it would be good for the team to disconnect and recharge. So he suggested we go camping, something none of us had ever done together before. It seemed like a harmless idea at first, just a quick escape into the woods to bond and unwind, but it quickly became something else entirely. The group consisted of me, Greg, our assistant manager Alice, and two of our co-workers, Peter and Elena. We rented a small cabin in a remote park about 4 hours north of the city. It was isolated, tucked away in a stretch of dense forest, far enough from the nearest town that we wouldn't be disturbed. Greg insisted on taking his 4x4, which had all the gear needed to make the trip as smooth as possible. It felt more like a team-building exercise than an actual break. But at that point, I wasn't questioning his intentions. I just wanted to get away. The drive up was uneventful. Greg made jokes, Elena laughed at them, and Peter kept to himself, mostly staring out the window. The woods were dense and dark, even though it was still afternoon. As we neared our destination, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the place looked more secluded than I had imagined. We pulled up to a small parking area, the only sign of life being a few scattered cabins, each a little more weathered than the last. When we got to our cabin, it was clear that it hadn't been used much. The door creaked when Greg opened it, and the interior smelled of dust and old wood. The place had a fireplace, a small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a porch that overlooked a shallow, murky lake. I set my bag down and took in the view, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it was peaceful, the kind of quiet that's almost too much after the constant hum of the city. We spent the evening setting up, cooking dinner, and sitting around the fire pit outside. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, except for the occasional rustle in the woods behind us. As night fell, I began to notice how much darker it was here than at home. The stars were bright overhead, but the forest behind us swallowed every hint of light. It felt like we were being slowly engulfed by the wilderness. At first, everything felt normal. We ate, joked, and talked about work, about the latest project, the next quarter's goals. Greg was in high spirits as usual, but as the night wore on, something started to feel off. Peter, who had been quiet for most of the evening, was acting stranger than usual. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes darting to the trees as if he expected someone, or something, to be watching us. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but the feeling was growing. The wind picked up a bit, making the trees sway and creak. It sounded like footsteps at first, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just the black void of the forest stretching out behind us. By the time we were ready to call it a night, the fire had burned down to embers. The cabin felt more isolated than before. We all retreated inside, and Greg suggested we leave the porch light on. Elena seemed to agree, saying it felt safer that way. I didn't think much of it, though the unease had grown enough that I felt like I wouldn't sleep easily. The first night was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. I tossed and turned, hearing every little noise in the woods. The wind was louder now, and there was something else, something that didn't quite feel right. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like something brushing against the cabin's walls. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The noise stopped as soon as I moved, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't get back to sleep. At first light, I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen. Greg was already awake, his face unreadable as he sipped his coffee. "We should head out for a hike," he said, trying to shake off the tension that had settled in the air. "Get some fresh air, clear our heads." We all agreed, though I noticed Peter looked more uneasy than usual. He kept glancing at the trees, as if expecting someone to step out from behind them, but we brushed it off. We grabbed our gear and set off down the trail that wound through the forest. The sun was higher now, and though the air felt cool, there was something off about the way the trees hung so low. The further we went, the thicker the forest became, and soon the path started to narrow. We weren't talking much. Elena, usually the most talkative, was silent, her eyes scanning the trees. Alice seemed uncomfortable too, and even Greg, who usually had a joke for everything, was quiet. That's when I heard it. A snap of a twig, faint but distinct. It wasn't the wind. I turned, expecting to see Peter behind me, but he wasn't there. My stomach dropped. I looked back down the trail, but Peter was nowhere in sight. We called his name, but there was no answer. Panic began to rise in my chest. Greg started shouting his name, but there was nothing, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant call of birds. We backtracked, searching in every direction. The trail twisted around, and we couldn't tell which way Peter had gone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, standing still in the trees just off the path. His face was blank, staring forward, as if he didn't see us. "Peter," I called out, but he didn't respond. I walked closer, trying to make sense of the situation, but as I neared him, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something wrong. His body was stiff, his skin pale, his eyes wide but not focusing. When I reached him, I waved my hand in front of his face. He blinked but didn't say a word. It wasn't until we touched his shoulder that he snapped out of it. His expression changed, his eyes darting around as if he had no idea where he was. He looked confused, disoriented. I don't remember how I got here," he said, his voice trembling. "I was just walking, and then it felt like I lost time." Greg took a step back, his face tight with concern. "We need to get back to the cabin now." We led Peter back to the cabin, but the rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. It was as though the forest had somehow gotten closer, more oppressive. No one said much, but the oddness of the situation hung in the air like a thick fog. That night, I decided to stay awake, keeping an eye on the windows. I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The wind had picked up again, louder this time, but still, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. Around midnight, I heard something, a tapping on the window. It was soft at first, like fingernails drumming against the glass. I froze, staring at the window. There was no one there. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. I jumped up, grabbing my flashlight and peering outside. There was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, watching me from the darkness. In the morning, things only got worse. Peter didn't look like himself. His eyes were bloodshot, and his movements were stiff, almost robotic. He said he didn't remember what had happened in the woods, but his hands were shaking, and he seemed frightened, as if the forest had taken something from him. Greg was adamant about leaving, But as we packed our things, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. A voice. It was faint at first, but as I turned toward the door, I heard it clearly. Leave. It was a whisper, almost lost in the wind, but it was there. I turned to Greg, my voice shaky. We need to go. Now. We didn't waste any time after that. We packed up and left, not looking back. As we drove out of the park, the sense of unease lifted, but I couldn't forget the way Peter had looked, how the forest seemed to have claimed something from him. I never returned to that place, and I never forgot the warning that came with the wind. Leave. It was late September, and the air was already turning cold. I was 27 years old, working a job in town that didn't give me a lot of chances to get away. When the weekend came, I knew I needed a break. The world was moving faster than I could keep up with, and the thought of sitting by a fire in the middle of nowhere seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I decided to head to the national forest about 30 miles outside of town, where the trails were known to be quiet and untouched. I'd heard stories about the woods, of course, but that kind of talk was usually just people trying to make it sound more mysterious than it was. I wasn't much of a believer in those kinds of things. It was just me and my old truck, a few bags of camping gear, and a long stretch of road that wound its way into the mountains. I arrived around dusk, setting up camp near a small creek that I thought would help drown out any sounds that could spook me. The place was peaceful, the kind of silence that makes you feel small. I set up my tent and started a fire, the warmth pushing back against the chill in the air. By the time the sun had fully dipped behind the trees, I was settled in, enjoying a can of beans heated over the fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound for a while, and the world felt like it was slowing down. But there was something else in the air too. It wasn't the usual quiet of nature. There was something wrong about it, something in the way the wind stopped for just a second before picking back up again. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to shake it off. As the night wore on, I found myself staring into the flames, watching the shadows dance on the trunks of the trees. A rustle from deeper in the woods made me pause, but it was probably just an animal. Another rustle came, this time closer. My eyes darted around, but nothing moved. The silence felt even heavier now. I stayed close to the fire, the heat a small comfort against the growing unease I couldn't shake. Then I heard it again. This time it was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't the usual noises I was used to, raccoons or deer or something. This sounded like footsteps, slow and careful, moving in a circle around my camp. I stood up, squinting into the darkness. My heart was thudding in my chest now, adrenaline spiking. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out into the trees. Nothing, just shadows that moved with the light. I cursed under my breath, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. Maybe it was a bear, though the footsteps didn't quite match. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound seemed amplified in the silence of the woods, and I kept hearing the slow, deliberate footsteps again. They never got close, but they didn't seem to leave either. By morning, I was exhausted, but I packed up my camp, figuring I'd head out for a hike to shake off the weirdness. The whole place had an odd, oppressive atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I wasn't about to let fear win, so I grabbed my pack and set off down the trail, trying to focus on the beauty of the trees and the quiet. The whole day was like that, beautiful but off, like something wasn't quite right. As I hiked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. There were no animal tracks, no birds, no squirrels, no signs of life at all. It was as if the forest had been emptied. The absence of sound made the place feel even more unnatural. I should have turned back, but stubbornness kept me going. Around midday, I stopped at a clearing to rest, sitting on a fallen log and trying to get some energy back. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, casting long shadows that made the clearing feel even smaller. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every now and then, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the rustling in the bushes. I stood up quickly, heart racing. The rustling wasn't just the wind. It was deliberate. Something, or someone, was moving through the underbrush, circling me. My mind went into overdrive, trying to reason it out, but the truth was, I was scared. I grabbed a large stick from the ground, ready to defend myself if need be. That's when I heard it clearly, a low, guttural growl. It didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard before, something deep in its throat, like a man trying to make a sound too horrible to imitate. My hand tightened around the stick, and I slowly backed away, trying to find the trail. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, where the light barely touched, stood a figure. It was tall, much too tall for a human, and its shape seemed unnatural, almost distorted. Its limbs were long and bent, like they were meant to move in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The thing stared at me, and its eyes, those eyes were pure black. Not the way animals' eyes reflect light, but pitch black, voids of nothingness that seemed to swallow up all the light around them. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, my foot catching on the log, but I didn't fall. I couldn't take my eyes off it, even as it slowly stepped forward, each movement jerky and unnatural. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but my legs felt frozen. The thing tilted its head, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was. I knew what it was. The stories had all started to make sense now. They weren't just ghost stories or tall tales from people trying to scare others. This thing, this creature, was something older, something that didn't belong. A skinwalker. I could feel my heart racing. The thing took another step, and then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't think. I just ran. My legs moved on their own, tearing through the forest, branches scratching at my arms and face, the sound of the creature's steps pounding behind me. I didn't dare look back. My breath was ragged, my legs screaming from the effort, but I couldn't stop. The trail blurred in front of me, and I kept going. I ran until my chest burned and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't hear it anymore, but I didn't trust the silence. When I reached my truck, I slammed the door shut, locking it in a panic. I sat there for a while, too terrified to start the engine. The forest was too quiet now, the kind of quiet that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Finally, I drove out of there, my hands shaking on the wheel, but I never looked back. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. The image of those black eyes stayed with me. It wasn't just some wild animal or a trick of the mind. It was something much worse. And no matter how far I drove or how long I stayed away from that place, I knew I'd never be able to forget what I had seen. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in nature, away from everything, that makes you feel alive. So, when I got the chance to head out into the woods for a weekend camping trip with a few friends, I didn't hesitate. It was early October, and the weather was perfect, cool enough to need a jacket but still warm enough to sit by the fire. We decided to camp at a place called Bear Creek, a spot a little off the beaten path but not too far from civilization. The trailhead wasn't too difficult, and the hike to our campsite was about an hour. We made it there in the afternoon, the sun just starting to dip behind the trees. I was with my friend Kyle and his younger cousin, Jake. Kyle and I had been friends since high school, and Jake was a bit younger, but he had come along to try to impress us. He was new to camping, but that didn't stop him from talking a big game. We set up camp quickly, and I began to prepare the fire while they worked on their tents. That night, everything was normal. We sat around the fire, made s'mores, and joked about old stories. The air was fresh, the stars were bright, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But it wasn't until after we went to bed that things started to take a strange turn. The night was quiet, too quiet. I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't like I heard anything or felt anything in particular, but something in the air was off. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. At first, I just tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. But then I woke up again, and this time, I heard it. A rustling sound. It was faint, but it was definitely there, like something or someone was moving through the brush near our campsite. I lay still, listening, my heart beginning to pound. I waited for a while, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I was just about to get up and check when I heard Kyle's voice from the other side of the tent. "Jake, what's going on?" His voice was low, but I could hear the unease in it. I held my breath, waiting for a response, but there was nothing. A minute passed, maybe two. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, careful, like someone was walking right up to the tent. I stayed perfectly still, not daring to make a sound. My mind raced. Could have been a bear or some other animal, but I wasn't sure. It felt like something more, like something was deliberately watching us. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and every muscle in my body was tense, waiting for whatever was coming next. Then, as suddenly as it started, the footsteps began to fade away. Slowly at first, then faster until they were gone completely. I didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity. I waited, straining to hear any more sounds. But the night had fallen silent again. I eventually convinced myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was probably a raccoon or some other animal. But that feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. The next morning, I woke up early, before Kyle and Jake. The sun had just begun to rise, and the forest was bathed in a soft golden light. The air was crisp, and the birds were chirping. Everything seemed calm again, as if the night's strange events were just a bad dream. But as I stepped outside the tent, I froze. Something was wrong. The campsite looked the same. Tents still pitched, the fire pit still smoldering, but there were footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy footprints, too big to be a bear's, but not quite human either. They were unmistakably fresh, though, as if whoever or whatever had walked past our tents had done so recently. I knelt down, studying the tracks. They were all over the campsite, leading out of our camp and into the woods. They seemed to circle around us, almost as if whoever made them had been watching us all night. I stood up quickly, heart racing. Kyle and Jake woke up a few minutes later, and I told them about the footprints. Kyle didn't seem too worried, chalking it up to a hiker or some other camper. But Jake, looking visibly shaken, asked if we should leave. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure either, but there was a nagging feeling deep inside that told me we shouldn't stay. Against Kyle's suggestion, I insisted we pack up and head back. We packed our things as quickly as we could, trying not to let the unease settle in too much. But as we made our way down the trail, I kept glancing behind us, half expecting someone to be following. The further we got, the more uneasy I felt. The woods around us were silent, too silent. About halfway back to the car, we came across something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't far from the trail, tucked between the trees, a makeshift shelter, like something a person might build if they were hiding out in the woods. It was small but well constructed, made of branches and leaves, almost blending into the surroundings. And inside, there was something else, something I couldn't fully make out at first. But as I got closer, my stomach churned. There were items scattered around the shelter: clothing, food wrappers, and a torn backpack. And there, at the edge of the shelter, was a set of eyes staring back at us. I couldn't tell if they were human or not, but they were watching us. The eyes blinked slowly, and then everything went dead quiet. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, before Kyle grabbed my arm and pulled me away. We didn't say a word, but all of us were running by the time we got back to the trailhead. The car felt like the safest place I'd ever been. We didn't speak much on the way back. Kyle didn't even try to make jokes or act like nothing had happened. We all knew something was wrong. We'd felt it, we'd seen it, and we had no explanation for it. To this day, I don't know what was out there in the woods that night. But I know one thing for sure, we were not alone. Something had been watching us, following us, and maybe it still is. And I'll never step foot near Bear Creek again. It was late October when I decided to take my dog, America, on a camping trip. I had been needing to get away, escape the noise of the city, and just spend some time alone. America, a big, loyal German shepherd, had been cooped up in the apartment for too long. She was energetic and loved the outdoors, so I figured this would be the perfect trip for both of us. I picked out a quiet spot in the mountains, not too far from home, but far enough to feel like I was truly alone. It was a place I'd camped at a few times before, though never in the fall. The trees had started turning, and the cool autumn air made the ground crunch underfoot. As I loaded up the car with our gear, America jumped around excitedly, barking and wagging her tail. We made the drive through winding, narrow roads. The landscape around us seemed to change the further we went, the forest growing denser, the trees taller. The sun was low in the sky by the time we arrived, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the road as we turned off onto the dirt path leading to the campsite. I'd set up camp quickly, making sure America had a spot to lie down near the fire pit. I built a small fire, and we sat together watching the flames dance. The night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped even faster. I wrapped myself in a heavy jacket, and America curled up beside me, her warm body providing comfort against the chill in the air. The silence around us was unsettling at first, but after a while, it became peaceful. The crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind were the only sounds. America laid still, her eyes occasionally darting around, keeping watch as she always did. As the fire began to die down, I threw another log on and decided to get some rest. I grabbed a blanket, rolled out my sleeping bag, and settled in. America lay at my feet as usual. I could hear her breathing softly, and I quickly fell asleep too. I woke up later, though disoriented. My eyes snapped open as I heard something outside the tent. At first, it was nothing more than a slight rustling, the kind the wind makes when it moves through the trees. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. A sharp crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. America's ears perked up immediately. She growled low in her throat, a sound I'd never heard from her before. I held my breath, waiting, trying to listen. The sound came again, this time unmistakably from just beyond the trees surrounding the campsite. My heart rate picked up. I slowly unzipped the tent a crack, careful not to make noise. The fire had burned down to embers, barely giving off any light, but I could still make out shapes in the shadows. The moon hung low in the sky, barely visible through the branches of the trees, casting everything in a pale, eerie glow. I scanned the area, my mind racing. The forest around me was dead quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. America growled again, louder this time, and I could tell she was agitated. She wasn't one to react like this, especially when we were alone. It was like she sensed something I couldn't see. I knew I had to check things out. Slowly, I grabbed the flashlight from the corner of the tent and stepped out, keeping my eyes on the trees. America followed closely behind me, her hackles raised. Her ears twitched, and she kept her nose to the ground, sniffing the air. I walked around the campsite cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of what might be out there. The fire pit was empty, the logs of wood scattered around the stone ring. Nothing seemed out of place, but the tension in the air was palpable, like something was lurking just beyond the tree line, waiting. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint rustling, coming from the brush off to my left. I turned the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing, just shadows and darkness. My mind was racing now. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just an animal, but something felt off. My instincts were screaming that I wasn't alone. The rustling stopped, and all was still again. America stood stiff next to me, her body tense, but she didn't bark or growl anymore. It was like she was waiting too, watching for whatever it was that I couldn't see. I stood there for a long while, just listening. After what felt like an eternity, I reluctantly made my way back to the tent, keeping the flashlight trained on the woods around me. The fire was just a faint glow now, the embers dying out. It seemed so quiet now, too quiet. I lay back down, my mind racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again, a faint shuffle, like someone or something moving through the leaves just beyond the edge of the trees. This time, America's low growl was a full-fledged bark. She shot to her feet, tail straight and tense. Her barking echoed through the stillness, and I could hear the movement outside the tent, getting closer. I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight again and burst out of the tent. The beams swept over the campsite, the trees, the brush, but there was nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the faint glow of the moonlight breaking through the canopy above. But then I saw something in the distance, beyond the trees, a dark shape, standing still, almost like it was watching me. I froze, my blood running cold. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could feel its presence, like it was staring right at me, waiting. "America, stay close," I whispered, even though I knew she was already on edge. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, me staring into the dark and America growling, her teeth bared. I kept the flashlight trained on the figure, but it didn't move. It was like it was just standing there watching. After what felt like hours, I heard something else. Another noise, but this one was different. It was a slow, rhythmic tapping, like something was walking across the forest floor. And it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent again. The tapping had stopped. The air felt thick, suffocating, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that whatever that figure was, it wasn't alone. My heart pounded in my chest, and America's growls were getting more intense, almost frantic. I needed to get out, fast. I turned and grabbed America by the collar, pulling her toward the car. I wasn't about to wait around to find out what that thing was, or what else was lurking in the woods. I ran, stumbling a bit over the uneven ground, but never looking back. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, and my mind was racing with every step. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness almost suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear America's heavy panting beside me. We reached the car, and I practically threw open the door, shoving America inside. I jumped in after her, slamming the door shut and locking it. I started the engine, my hands shaking as I threw the car into gear. I didn't stop driving until I reached home. I didn't care if I was awake for the rest of the night. I just needed to be back where I knew it was safe. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me. I don't know what I saw that night or who or what was out there in the woods, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that spot. America and I both know it wasn't just an animal. There was something else in those woods, something far darker, something that followed us all the way back to the car. I don't think I'll ever feel safe out there again.